Good morning, Highlands Presbyterian. So our gospel reading today is from the first chapter of Mark. We're wrapping up Mark 1, and we're starting in verse 40. And a leper came to Jesus, imploring him, and kneeling said to him, "If you will, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, Jesus stretches out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I will, be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. And Jesus sternly charged him and sent him away at once, and said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded, for a proof to them." But he went out and began to talk openly about it and to spread the news, so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in desolate places, and people were coming to him from every quarter. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So borders exist for various reasons. I remember as a child, my sister took the borders between foods on her plate very seriously, to the extent she would set up napkins under certain parts of her plate if one of the parts of dinner was particularly runny, so it would not infringe upon the other food, trying to keep them separated, boundaries between the foods. I eat everything today out of one bowl, so it clearly didn't carry over. But we find borders in other places, right? Anybody who's had more than one child in the back seat knows that at a certain time they will erect an imaginary boundary between the two of them on that car seat. And inevitably, one of them will infringe upon that imaginary boundary, leading to much conflict. Right? Part of being a parent is you learn how to drive forwards while refereeing backwards. Right? Boundaries matter in such a world. And we've learned, certainly over the last 18 months, how much boundaries and borders matter. Right? 6 feet has become a measurement we all know in our minds a lot better, right? And when someone infringes upon that 6 feet, it's a very different reaction depending on your perspective on the risk of COVID, right? For some people, if people come within that 6 feet circle, it's fine, while as others react, it's a very stressful reaction. I remember reading about a restaurant that had given people inner tubes to wear, that erected the 6-foot boundary as a visual border as to how close we could get to each other, right? That became a real boundary in society almost overnight, right? Borders matter, and we think about them sort of on a larger scale, right? We can't help but be caught up in the events as to what's happening on the southern border of the U.S., right? Migrants are streaming to the border, right? Often leaving behind trauma, often leaving behind poverty, hoping to find opportunity on the other side of the border, right? And it's not unique to the U.S. border. There are borders around the world where these same events are being replayed, where there are groups of people trying to find a better life, trying to secure a better life for themselves, trying to find peace, trying to find prosperity, right? And so as a country, we're in the midst of that debate, right? What policies are appropriate to respond to that crisis? What response, right, we ask ourselves is most faithful to the gospel? Right? When we see a group of people gathered under a bridge or crammed into a small boat drifting towards the coast, right? How do you react? What do you think? What would you do if you were there? Right? I've always found it's a much more rich conversation when we recognize that these are individuals in this situation, right? When we focus and the story takes on a name and it takes on a life, right? You can relate to the people because you realize they aren't necessarily any different than you or I, right? They were born in a different place, in different circumstances, and at a certain point, they had to make this incredibly difficult decision about leaving behind what they know to strike out with hope for something new. right? When you hear an individual story, there's a breaking down of a border, of a boundary, right? When you hear the story, you are touching them, letting them touch you, right? And we are forced as Christians, right, to respond with compassion, right? And so what is the compassionate thing to do? Is it to let someone into the country and support them as they build a life? Is it to work, to join in work that is going on in the countries where people are leaving, to create better situations in those situations? Is it to sit and weep at the brokenness in the world that drives such decisions, right? What's the most compassionate thing for you to do, right? The important thing is that we break the boundary that separates one from another, so that we recognize the humanity that is on both sides of the border, so that we respond with compassion. There are ministries of compassion focused on immigrants here in Columbus, right? What does it look like for us to reach out compassion with those who are in our midst here in this place? Right? Because this is exactly what Jesus does in the gospel today. There is someone who comes to him who is separated by a boundary, and Jesus reaches out with compassion and reaches across the boundary, because that is the faithful thing to do in this situation, right? And so Jesus is facing someone with leprosy. And when the Bible talks about leprosy, it's not necessarily the same thing that we think that is true of leprosy today. Lepers in the Bible could have had a range of skin conditions, any one of which would have had a dramatic impact on someone's life. There's a provision for what life would be like. They had to wear torn clothes and let their hair hang loose, crying out, "Unclean, unclean." They were to dwell in a separate place from the rest of the community out of fear that they might contaminate someone. So their life was filled with anguish, right? Physical anguish, mental anguish, emotional, relational. They were isolated, separated from the community. If they did attend a synagogue service, there was a screen erected to separate them from the rest of the congregation. They were an afterthought to most people, and likely lived devoid of hope that the situation might change, that there might be improvement in their situation, right? If there was any thread of hope, they would have pulled it as far as it would go to change their situation. And so the desperation of this leper in this story in Mark 1 makes sense, right? He comes to Jesus, kneeling, says to him, "If you will, you can make me clean." It's interesting. It's not even a question. It's a statement of fact, but one so pregnant with hope, with the possibility that Jesus might change everything about his situation. If you will, you can make me clean. To know that hope is right there, right? What does that feel like? To stare across the boundary into a foreign situation, into a different life, one perhaps dreamed of. But I'm sure many of those dreams were given up on. Right? But what does he do? On the other side of that boundary, he meets incredible compassion. Right? Jesus is moved with compassion, and he does something extraordinary. Right? He stretches out his hand and he touches him, which would not have happened. Nobody does that, because if you touch it, you risk being contaminated. But Jesus reaches across that boundary, across that border, and touches the leper, and in so doing, honoring his humanity and saying, "I will be clean." Jesus isn't afraid of the risk of contamination. He isn't scared off by a border or a boundary, but he crosses that, because that is how Jesus makes us clean. He exchanges, right, the leper's uncleanliness for cleanliness. He takes on the uncleanliness of the world to make the world clean, right? And what he does is amazing. He doesn't just heal him physically, but he also heals him relationally, right? He sends him back to the priests to show himself as clean. And in so doing, he's inviting this man back into the community, into the habits and rhythms of the larger community. He's giving this man back a community, relationships. It's more than just physical healing. He's been isolated, and now he doesn't have to be isolated anymore. Right? And we've all learned over the last 18 months how hard it is to be alone, how hard it is to be isolated, how important relationships are. Right? And so the scripture is reminding us to reach out to those in our community who are still isolated, to reach out, to work on those relationships, to restore, to rebuild, to sustain. And then so the man is sent to show himself to the priests. And what happens is Jesus tells him not to say anything to anyone. And there's a lot of ink spilled over why that might be, and it's thought that maybe it's not, so that there might be so much publicity about these miracles that would prevent Jesus from moving about freely. But that's exactly what happens, right? The man goes and begins telling everyone. And so Jesus could no longer openly enter into town. And so isn't it interesting, right? So Jesus gives this man his freedom. He's no longer bound by this leprosy. In exchange, Jesus loses his freedom because Jesus is now unable to go about as he might because these crowds are everywhere. And so Jesus is restricted. Jesus is less free, but this man is free, right? And that's the story of the gospel, right? That you and I, right, are chained by sin. We are bound by sin, by human brokenness. But Jesus reaches across the boundary that separates us from God. He crosses that in the incarnation, becomes fully human. And he sets us free. He sets us free from sin. He sets us free from despair. Now we are bold enough to have hope, and we are free. To do so, Jesus gave up his freedom, right? He took on sin. He took on uncleanliness. He took it on. And so Jesus exchanges his freedom for our own. He gives us his freedom. So we are free to hope, free to serve, free to love. And so the question is, what do we do with that freedom? What do we do in the world? Now that we are bold enough to have hope, to have a secure hope in what our future looks like, how will we act in the world around us? Will we reach across boundaries, across borders? Whether they're in our neighborhoods, in our cities, right? We all know there aren't formal borders in cities and the places we live, but there are places we go and places we don't go. Will we reach across those? Will we listen to the stories and honor the individuals? Will we use our freedom to serve and to love? Because when Christ saw us, Christ was moved with compassion, and he chose to make us clean. What will we do with that gift?